In the 16th century in Europe, people drank the warm blood of those who had been executed, right next to the places of execution. An ointment was made from the bodies of the executed, axungia hominis, human fat, which was applied to the chest and joints. To strengthen the body, pharaohs were ground into powder and sold in pharmacies. This was called treatment. Sounds like a nightmare? No. This is the history of medicine. You did not mishear. Europeans did not just fear death, they consumed it. In powder, in wine, in ointments. They let death into themselves, believing that this way they could cheat their own. And this is not fiction. In pharmaceutical reference books, for example, in Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, Mumia vera Egyptiaca stood alongside opium and myrrh. The jars were labeled Mumia vera, 1 drachma per day, and people took it as routinely as we take vitamins today. But the scariest thing is that they didn't even know what they were drinking. The word mumia in Arabic meant bitumen, a natural resin. And when these treatises were translated in Europe, it was decided that it was not resin, but the substance with which Egyptian mummies were saturated. A translation error, and it became a deadly business. Imagine a 16th century pharmacy. Wooden shelves, the smell of incense. In glass jars, not herbs, but fine brown dust. Once, these were the remains of a human being. Perhaps a king. Perhaps a criminal. The pharmacist pours a spoonful of powder into a glass of wine and says calmly, "Drink this, and your heart disease will recede." Bodies that were supposed to rest in eternity were sold by the pound. They were bought in the markets of Venice, Paris, and London. Even in Kiev, through Turkish merchants. 1 pound of a real mummy cost more than gold. And this was not marginal madness. It was medicine for the rich. You may ask, didn't anyone see this as cannibalism? No. Because in a world where death was everywhere, plague, war, famine, consuming it seemed not like savagery, but like an opportunity. Death was sold as medicine. And those who feared it most began to consume it. But that was only the beginning. Because then death turned into alchemy. And European kings began to drink the elixir of immortality, made from mummies. 16th century Europe was not looking for truth, it was looking for miracles. When they couldn't find them in the church, they looked in the grave. Scientists, alchemists, doctors, all were obsessed with one idea. If the pharaoh's body had not decomposed in 3,000 years, then it must hold the secret to life. And if you ingested it, you could regain strength, youth, even love. It got to the point where even court physicians recommended drinking mummy powder with wine as a remedy for aging and weakness. This is how the medicine of death was born. Imagine a court physician in France. On the table are glasses of wine, a crystal flask, leeches, and dried frogs. And a small box with the inscription Mumia vera. Inside is ground powder. A little death, for health. The chronicles of the 16th century mention that Francis I allegedly drank mummy tincture with alcohol to strengthen the heart. Later descriptions attribute to Louis XIV a bottle of Pharaoh's elixir, given to him by his personal physician. Whether this is true is debated by historians, but such stories circulated in the courts of Europe. Kings drank death to rule longer. It was believed that if the pharaoh's body had been preserved for 3,000 years, its power was immortal. And a piece of that power could be bought. Pharmacies sold mummies alongside gold and mercury as the most valuable ingredient. But demand grew. And very quickly, Egypt could not keep up with the demand for immortality. Then the fakes began. In Cairo, Alexandria, and on the black markets, a new product appeared, Mumia falsa. Fresh mummies, made from the bodies of slaves, executed criminals, or even beggars. They were dried, wrapped in cloth, soaked in resin, and sold as Egyptian originals. Some alchemists said, a fresh mummy is stronger. It has not yet lost its spirit. Others went further. They added the blood of the executed to the powder to enhance the effect. Medicine, religion, alchemy, Everything merged into one terrible cult of immortality. Those who were supposed to heal became priests of death. Pharmacists grew rich. Alchemists wrote treatises on the black gold of mummies. And no one asked any questions. For how could anyone doubt when the king himself supposedly drank death and paid for it as if it were life? But that's not the end of it. There is a place where death was sold by the pound, where even the remains of pharaohs became commodities and were shipped overseas, where mummies became currency, and human bodies became resources. Cairo, 17th century. The midday sun melts the stone, the air shimmers with heat. Among the rows of spices and gold, another commodity. Mummies. Black, wrapped in cloth, with cracked sarcophagi and bags of dark dust. Apothecaries from Paris pay well, says the merchant, removing the veil from the face of the remains. The crowd turns away. And the merchant from Venice calmly counts his coins. This is not a scene from a horror movie, it is a normal day at the Cairo market. Here, mummies were sold by weight. Mummies were taken out of tombs, weighed, packed, and shipped to Europe. Ships from Alexandria set sail loaded with mummies, like sacks of grain. The Venetian archives contain dry records. Arrival of a shipment of mummies. Weight 600 pounds. Purpose, pharmaceutical needs. Not a word about desecration. Not a hint of doubt. For Europe, it was simply trade. Powder from the pharaohs was mixed with wine. Remains from Giza were processed into an ointment for rheumatism. And for artists, into paint. Yes, paint. Mummy brown was the favorite shade of painters in the 17th to 19th centuries. It was made from ground mummies, bitumen, and resins. Rembrandt, Delacroix, they all used it. This color had a warm, lively shade. An artist could literally mix paint with the ashes of ancient burials and paint the face of a living customer sitting next to him. Ironic, isn't it? Dead pharaohs painted portraits of living kings. Europe turned death into matter, into business, into aesthetics. And when there were no more bodies in the sands of Egypt, they invented a legend. They began to talk about the curse of the pharaohs. They said that everyone who touched the mummies died. But it wasn't magic. It was guilt. Newspapers wrote sensational headlines. London doctors fall ill after working with Egyptian dust. The curse of the pharaohs has reached Paris. Europe felt that it had crossed the line. But instead of stopping, it resorted to even greater cynicism. Because now death had become not only medicine, but also fashion. Mummies were bought not only by pharmacists, but also by aristocrats. For private offices, collections, and even entertainment. In London and Paris, mummy evenings appeared, where sarcophagi were opened in front of guests, and the remains found were displayed. People drank wine, applauded, and collected souvenirs. This was what civilization looked like. But very soon, this market of darkness would come closer than Egypt. Because death would no longer be sought in the sands, but at home. On the scaffold. Europe no longer waited for ships from Egypt. The dead were nearby. And the freshest, mummies, now came not from the desert, but from the scaffold. People believed that if you took a piece of the dead inside, you could take on their strength. It wasn't called cannibalism. It was called medicine. In Germany and England, executioners received strange requests. Not to rush after the execution, to let the body preserve itself. An ointment was made from the bodies of the executed, Axungia hominis, human fat. It was applied to wounds, breasts, and joints. For rheumatism, lung diseases, and to strengthen the body. As written in pharmacy books. It was sold officially. In pharmacies, next to cinnamon and mint. It got to the point where in some countries human fat was officially included in pharmacy reference books, alongside herbs and medicines. But the most terrifying thing happened right next to the execution sites. When people were executed, crowds gathered nearby. People waited to get the still warm blood, and drank it immediately, believing that it would heal them. From epilepsy, doctors said. It wasn't an official prescription in every pharmacy, But doctors at the time did recommend the blood of the executed as a remedy for epilepsy, and people believed it. It seemed more like a ritual than a crime. People believed that death had healing powers. Chronicles wrote about how old men, women, and children stood near the gallows, waiting for the miraculous cure. One German priest noted, "They drink death in the name of Christ." Theologians tried to justify it. They said that at the moment of death, the soul releases its life essence, and whoever accepts it will receive a part of divine power. So they sanctified cannibalism with prayer. But the real reason was simpler: fear. Europeans feared death so much that they decided, if they let it in, it would cease to be their enemy. It was a time when churches prayed for the soul of the executed, and pharmacies sold his remains. When death became a commodity. When the body ceased to belong to God, and became the property of the pharmacist. Europe learned not just to kill. It learned to dispose. And yet, somewhere in the shadows, doubt was beginning to emerge. Doctors were beginning to notice that these miracle drugs did not cure. That the death they were selling brought only illness and shame. And that perhaps the real curse of the pharaohs was not magic, but their own conscience. When Europe finally awoke from its alchemical slumber, it saw itself in the mirror. And what it saw was more frightening than any mummy. On its lips, stains from Egyptian dust. On its hands, traces of someone else's blood. Guilt in its heart. The 19th century brought a new era: reason, progress, science. But the memory of darkness did not disappear. It was simply wrapped in a different shell. In literature, in fashion, in shows, the mummy became a Gothic symbol. What was once sold in pharmacies was now sold as history. In the novels of Edgar Allan Poe, Conan Doyle, and Lovecraft, the pharaohs returned from the dead. But not for revenge. For remembrance. Because the curse of the pharaohs was not Egyptian. It was European. It was not the dead who took revenge on the living. It was the living who punished themselves with memory. And even in the 19th century, when Europe had already begun to be ashamed of itself, the temptation of death remained. In the Victorian era, mummies became fashionable again. London salons held mummy banquets, where a sarcophagus was opened in front of guests, and the remains found were displayed. Women fainted, men applauded. And someone took a piece of fabric as a souvenir. One English lady wrote in her diary, "When the last layer was removed, I smelled spices. It was the smell of centuries. I breathed it in, and knew I had touched history." She was wrong. It wasn't the smell of history. It was the smell of decay. Theologians wrote, Europe tasted the flesh of the past, and became sick from it. And they were right. Because even when the mummies stopped being ground into powder, they continued to be consumed, with the eyes, hands, and curiosity. Europe tried to forget, but every time it looked at the sarcophagus, it saw not Egypt, but itself. The curse of the pharaohs was not magic. It was that Europe had destroyed what was sacred, and could not justify it. It consumed the past, and then began to fear its own reflection. But something new will be born from the ruins of this guilt. Scientists will replace alchemists. And for the first time, death will cease to be a cure. The 18th century. After hundreds of years of death being a cure, Europe finally begins to study it. For the first time, not to take it internally, but to understand it. What used to be sold in vials and bottles now lay on the dissecting table. Bodies ceased to be raw material for immortality. They became material for science. 1789. The French Academy of Medicine officially bans the use of mummies in pharmacopoeias. Mumia vera is removed from all lists of medicines. For the first time in several centuries, death loses its license to sell. The alchemist gave way to the anatomist. Doctors no longer sought the magical essence in bodies. They sought patterns. Blood and fat no longer healed. They explained how the body worked and why it stopped working. Universities are turning into laboratories. The descendants of the same apothecaries who once traded in mummies now stand at microscopes. Now they dissect to understand, not to become gods. But even in this new age of reason, the shadow of the past has not yet faded. British trade archives contain records from the 1920s. Import of mummies. Purpose: pharmaceutical and fertilizer needs. Yes. Even 300 years after the first pharmacies in Venice, some companies in Britain were still buying mummies, grinding them into powder, and using them for industrial purposes, including as fertilizer. History does not change overnight. It decomposes slowly, like a body that does not want to disappear. But still, it was the end of the Dark Ages. For the first time, people stopped seeing magic in death. They saw a pattern, and instead of consuming the unknown, they decided to understand it. You may ask, how did it happen that a civilization that built cathedrals, wrote symphonies, and discovered the laws of physics also traded in death and called it treatment? The answer is simple. Europeans did not consume death out of savagery. They did it out of fear. They believed that life could be bought. That immortality was not a gift, but a commodity. That if you took a part of the past inside you, you could cheat time. In churches, they prayed for the salvation of the soul. And in pharmacies, they sold the salvation of the body. The priests blessed the bread of life, and the pharmacists sold the dust of death. And both believed that they were saving people. The irony is that they really did find immortality, but not where they were looking. The pharaohs they dug up calmly outlived those who consumed their remains. Their faces still lie under glass in museums, while the names of pharmacists and kings have been erased by dust. The pharaohs built tombs so they would not be disturbed. The Europeans opened them and saw not eternal life, but their own reflection. Because the fear of death is not a flaw of past eras. It lives on today. We have simply changed its form. We no longer drink death, we buy it. In jars labeled detox, rejuvenation, eternal skin. In advertisements that promise to stop time. In the belief that you can live longer if you find the right formula. We no longer accept mummies. We accept illusions. And we still try to defeat what we fear most, our own end. They consume death in order to live. But that is what made them dead. Long before their hearts stopped.